If it weren't for my sister, none of this would have happened, my nephew said as he raised a glass at our Thanksgiving dinner. And just like that, 35 years of my life were erased in a single sentence. I'm Rachel Carter, 67 years old, and I never imagined that the most painful betrayal of my life would come wrapped in smiles, pumpkin pie, and the warm glow of a family holiday. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite day of the year. It wasn't because of the food, although I loved the smell of turkey roasting in the oven and the cinnamon scent drifting from homemade pies. It was because Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude. It was the one day when family gathered around the same table and remembered who had stood beside them through the hard years. At least, that was what I used to believe. That year, my daughter insisted on hosting the dinner at her beautiful home outside Denver. By late afternoon, every seat around the long dining table was filled. My grandchildren laughed in the living room. Football played softly on the television. Outside, the November sky glowed orange as the sun began to set behind the hills. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I noticed it the moment I walked through the front door. My older sister, Vanessa, was the center of attention. Everywhere she went, people followed. Every story somehow circled back to her. Every conversation ended with someone praising her wisdom, her generosity, her support. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Vanessa had always enjoyed attention. That was nothing new. But as the evening went on, something felt different. It was as though an invisible story had been written about our family, and somehow I had been edited out of it. After dinner, my grandson brought out a framed photo collage celebrating our family's achievements. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, weddings, vacations. Near the center was a photograph of the business I had built from nothing more than a folding desk in my garage. I stared at it. Underneath the picture was a small engraved plaque, founded with the guidance and support of Vanessa Carter. My stomach tightened. I blinked twice, convinced I had read it wrong. But the words remained. Vanessa smiled modestly as everyone applauded. She was always the visionary, someone said. Rachel was lucky to have her. Lucky. I felt my fingers tighten around my coffee cup. For 35 years, I had worked before sunrise and long after sunset. I had mortgaged my house. I had missed vacations. I had sacrificed weekends. I had survived setbacks that nearly destroyed me. Vanessa had never attended a single client meeting. She had never signed a contract. She had never worked a day in that company. Yet there she sat, accepting credit as if it belonged to her. Across the table, I noticed my mother. Margaret Carter was 88 years old now. Her silver hair framed a face lined with decades of experience. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't applauding. She was watching me. Her expression carried something I couldn't quite identify. Sadness, regret, maybe even guilt. Then our eyes met. For a brief moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something. Something important. Something she had been carrying for a very long time. And when Vanessa stood up to make another speech about the family's success, my mother slowly lowered her gaze to the table. That was the moment I realized this story was much bigger than a stolen compliment. Someone had been hiding the truth for years, and before Thanksgiving was over, everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change. For the rest of the evening, I barely heard what anyone was saying. Laughter drifted around the dining room. Plates were cleared. Fresh coffee was poured. Someone brought out pecan pie. The celebration continued exactly as it always had, yet I felt strangely disconnected from it, as if I were watching my own family through a window. Every time Vanessa spoke, people listened. Every time she told a story, someone nodded in agreement. What troubled me most was not that she enjoyed the attention. It was that everyone seemed to believe a version of history that I did not recognize. As I sat there quietly, memories began surfacing one after another. 35 years earlier, there had been no applause, no recognition, and certainly no audience. There had only been me, a folding desk, an outdated computer, and a determination to create something better for my family. Back then, I worked from a small garage behind my house. In the summer, the heat would rise well above 90 degrees. In the winter, I wore gloves while answering calls because I could not afford better heating. There were nights when I slept only 4 hours. There were weekends when I missed birthday parties and neighborhood gatherings because deadlines mattered more than comfort. I never complained. I believed sacrifice was part of building a future. During those years, Vanessa lived a very different life. She was charming, social, and loved being surrounded by people. She attended charity dinners, community events, and every celebration imaginable. There was nothing wrong with that. We simply walked different paths. The strange thing was that she had never shown much interest in my business. She rarely asked questions about it. She never visited the garage. She never sat beside me during the difficult years when failure seemed only one step away. Yet somehow, over time, a different story had emerged. I tried to remember when I first noticed it. A comment at a family reunion. A joke during Christmas dinner. A casual remark from a cousin who thanked Vanessa for helping build the company. At the time, I laughed it off. I assumed people were exaggerating. I assumed the misunderstanding would correct itself. Instead, it grew. Year after year, the details shifted. Small inaccuracies became accepted facts. Accepted facts became family history. Looking back, I realized how often I had remained silent. Perhaps I was too busy. Perhaps I thought the truth was obvious enough to defend itself. As I stared across the table that Thanksgiving evening, I began to wonder if silence had been my biggest mistake. Then I noticed my mother again. She was no longer eating. Her hands rested quietly beside her plate. Her eyes moved between Vanessa and me with an expression I could not ignore. It was the look of someone carrying a burden, a secret. When dessert ended, she slowly pushed back her chair and stood. For a moment, I thought she was simply tired and heading home. Instead, she looked directly at me and said in a calm voice, "Rachel, would you step outside with me for a few minutes?" The room fell strangely quiet, and for reasons I could not explain, my heart began to race. I followed my mother through the sliding glass door and onto the back patio. The cold November air felt refreshing after the warmth of the crowded dining room. In the distance, I could hear my grandchildren laughing inside, completely unaware that something important was unfolding just a few yards away. My mother lowered herself carefully into a wooden chair beside the porch railing. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. She looked out across the dark yard, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The silence stretched long enough to make me uneasy. Finally, I sat beside her. "Mom, what is going on?" I asked softly. She sighed. It was not the tired sigh of an elderly woman. It was the sigh of someone carrying a burden for far too long. "Rachel," she said, "there is something I should have told you years ago." A chill ran through me despite my coat. "What do you mean?" She stared toward the trees beyond the fence. I thought I was protecting the family. Her voice trembled slightly. Instead, I may have helped create this situation. My heart began beating faster. Inside the house, I could see Vanessa through the kitchen window. She was smiling as she spoke with several relatives gathered around the island. Everyone seemed drawn to her. Everyone seemed comfortable with the version of history she presented. "Mom," I said carefully, "what are you talking about?" She turned toward me. Her eyes looked older than I had ever seen them. "Do you remember the first year your company started making real money?" Of course I remembered. It had been one of the happiest moments of my life. After years of uncertainty, I had finally signed contracts that gave the business stability. "Yes," I replied. "I remember." She nodded slowly. "That was when the trouble began." I frowned. "What trouble?" She hesitated. "Vanessa became obsessed with being part of your success." I blinked. The statement sounded strange. She never showed any interest in the business. "Not publicly," Mom said quietly. "But privately, it was different." I felt my stomach tighten. "What are you saying?" My mother looked down at her hands. There were conversations, arguments, things you never saw. The cold air suddenly felt much heavier. "Why did nobody tell me?" She gave a sad smile. "Because I asked everyone not to." I stared at her. For a moment, I could not speak. "You what?" She nodded. "I thought the problem would disappear. I thought family harmony mattered more than old resentments." She looked back toward the house. I was wrong. Through the window, Vanessa laughed at something someone said. Several relatives laughed with her. My mother followed my gaze. "They believe her because the story has been repeated for years," she said. "People eventually accept whatever they hear often enough." I swallowed hard. "Mom, what exactly happened?" Instead of answering, she slowly reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Then she removed a small brass key. It looked old, worn smooth by decades of use. She placed it gently into my hand. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I want you to come to my house. There is something you need to see." I barely slept that night. The small brass key sat on my kitchen table beside a half-finished cup of coffee, catching the glow from the overhead light every time I walked past it. By sunrise, I was already dressed and driving toward my mother's house. The roads were quiet. Most people were still recovering from the holiday, sleeping late after spending time with family. I wished my mind were that peaceful. Instead, questions circled endlessly through my thoughts. What had my mother been hiding all these years? Why had she waited until now? And most importantly, what did any of this have to do with Vanessa taking credit for my work? My mother lived in the same white farmhouse where she had spent nearly 50 years. The porch looked exactly as it always had. A rocking chair sat near the front door. Wind chimes moved gently in the cold morning breeze. When I arrived, she was already waiting. She opened the door before I could knock. Neither of us wasted time with small talk. She led me upstairs to a room I had not entered in years. It had once belonged to my father. After he passed away, Mom rarely opened it. The furniture remained untouched, preserved almost like a time capsule. She walked toward an old wooden wardrobe standing against the far wall. Then she pointed to a small brass lock attached to one of the lower drawers. "Use the key," she said quietly. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked open immediately. Inside sat a small wooden box covered with dust. I lifted it carefully onto the bed and opened the lid. The first thing I saw was a stack of folders. Beneath them were envelopes, handwritten notes, photographs, and legal documents. Some were more than 20 years old. My mother sat down beside me. "Start with the blue folder," she said. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten almost instantly. The documents inside contained copies of early business records from the first years of my company. Contracts, registration forms, meeting notes. My name appeared everywhere. That was not surprising. What shocked me was another name written repeatedly in the margins. Vanessa. I turned another page. Then another. Several documents contained handwritten comments. Some requested ownership changes. Others suggested revisions that would have altered how the company was represented. The dates matched the exact period when my business first became successful. "Mom," I whispered, looking up at her. "Why do you have all of this?" She lowered her eyes. "Because I was asked to keep it." "By who?" For a moment, she did not answer. Then she reached into the box and handed me a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were 4 words that immediately sent a chill through me. "To be opened if necessary." The signature underneath belonged to my father. My hands felt strangely cold as I stared at my father's handwriting. He had been gone for nearly 18 years. Yet seeing those familiar letters instantly brought back memories of Sunday breakfasts, long conversations on the porch, and the steady confidence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Carefully, I opened the envelope. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. "Rachel, if you are reading this, it means the situation I worried about has finally become serious enough that the truth must be known." I stopped breathing for a moment. My mother sat quietly beside me, allowing me to continue. "Your success belongs to you. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Over the years, I became aware of growing resentment within the family. I hoped it would fade. Unfortunately, I fear it may only grow stronger if left unaddressed. My eyes moved down the page. Several years ago, there was an attempt to create the appearance that your company was built through a partnership that never existed. Certain documents were presented to me for review. I refused to support them. Because of that, I began keeping records. If necessary, those records are stored securely. I lowered the letter and looked at my mother. "What documents?" I asked quietly. She reached into the wooden box and removed another folder. Unlike the others, this one was thick. Inside were copies of correspondence dating back more than 20 years. Letters, notes, memorandums. As I read them, a pattern slowly emerged. During the period when my company was becoming profitable, Vanessa had repeatedly attempted to position herself as an advisor, contributor, and strategic partner despite having no operational role in the business. At first, the claims were subtle. Then they became more ambitious. Some drafts even suggested future biographies and family records should describe the company as a shared achievement. I felt stunned. "This cannot be real," I whispered. "Why would she do this?" My mother looked toward the window. "Because she wanted to be connected to something successful." I sat silently. The answer sounded simple, yet the consequences stretched across decades. One document after another revealed conversations I had never known existed. Family members had questioned the claims. My father had challenged them. My mother had documented everything. Then I found a handwritten note from my father attached to one file. The sentence was short, but it hit me harder than anything else in the box. Repeated stories eventually become accepted memories. Protect the truth. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, countless moments from the past made sense. The inaccurate introductions, the exaggerated stories, the gradual shift in family perception. None of it had happened overnight. It had been built one conversation at a time over many years. When I finally looked up, my mother seemed relieved for the first time since Thanksgiving. "There is more," she said softly. "Much more." Then she reached to the bottom of the box and removed a sealed folder marked with a date from 21 years earlier. The moment I saw the name written across the front, my heart sank. It contained evidence from the one meeting that could change everything. With a deep breath, I opened the sealed folder. The date stamped across the top immediately caught my attention. It was from the spring of the year my company landed its first major national contract. I remembered that season well. I had been traveling constantly, meeting clients, hiring employees, and trying to keep up with a business that was growing faster than I ever imagined. At the time, I thought everyone in my family was celebrating alongside me. Now I was not so sure. Inside the folder was a collection of meeting notes, letters, and signed statements. The first document described a private meeting held at my parents' house. I had never attended it because I had been out of state meeting with a potential client. According to the notes, Vanessa had gathered several relatives and presented herself as an important force behind my success. She spoke confidently about business decisions she had never made. She described strategies she had never created. She even suggested that family support should eventually be recognized publicly because, in her words, no one succeeds alone. At first glance, the statement seemed harmless. But the deeper I read, the more disturbing the picture became. Attached to the notes were letters written by my father shortly after the meeting. In one, he expressed concern that facts were already being distorted. In another, he warned that repeated exaggerations could eventually become accepted truth. Then I found something that made me stop completely. A signed statement from Ethan Brooks. My heart skipped. Ethan had been the first investor who believed in me when almost everyone else said my business would fail. He had reviewed my plans, taken a chance on my vision, and opened doors that changed my future. His statement was detailed and unmistakable. He confirmed that every major decision during the company's early years had been made directly with me. He specifically noted that Vanessa had never participated in management, planning, financing, or operations. The statement had been signed, dated, and notarized. I looked up at my mother in disbelief. "Why did Ethan write this?" I asked. My mother folded her hands. "Because your father asked him to." "Why?" Her eyes filled with sadness. "Because your father realized the stories were already spreading. He wanted independent proof before memories started changing." I sat back against the bed, overwhelmed by the realization. My father had seen the danger decades earlier. He had understood something I never noticed. The truth does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually, one conversation at a time, until people can no longer separate facts from repetition. I continued reading. Several relatives had privately questioned Vanessa's claims over the years. Each time, she presented herself as a humble supporter rather than a participant. Slowly, perceptions shifted. The process was subtle enough that few people noticed it happening. By the time I reached the final page, my hands were trembling. The evidence was undeniable. My father had spent years preserving the truth. My mother had protected the records. And now those records were sitting in front of me. Then my mother quietly reached into the box one final time and placed a recent photograph on the bed. "There is one more thing you need to understand," she said. The moment I saw who was standing beside Vanessa in the picture, I realized this story was about to become even more complicated. The photograph showed Vanessa standing beside my nephew Daniel at a charity banquet held just 6 months earlier. At first, nothing seemed unusual about it. They were smiling, dressed formally, standing in front of a banner celebrating local business leaders. Then I noticed the plaque in Daniel's hands. The award recognized outstanding contributions to entrepreneurship and community development. My stomach tightened. I remembered that award. The foundation had originally contacted me about it, but I had declined the ceremony because of a scheduling conflict. Apparently, the event had continued without me. "Look closer," my mother said. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back was a short note in Vanessa's handwriting. Daniel finally understands who really built the family's success story. I stared at the words. What does this mean? My mother leaned back slowly. Daniel has been hearing Vanessa's version of events for years. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. Daniel had become one of the most vocal supporters of Vanessa's claims. At family gatherings, he often introduced her as the person who guided my career. I always assumed he was repeating harmless family lore. Now I understood something different had been happening. An entire generation had grown up hearing a carefully crafted version of history. Why did nobody correct it? I asked quietly. My mother looked at me with a mixture of sadness and regret. Some people did, but every correction sounded small compared to years of repetition. I lowered my eyes to the photograph. The realization was painful. Nobody had stolen my achievements overnight. The process had happened gradually. A story repeated often enough had become accepted as fact. My mother opened another folder and handed me several printed emails. These were far more recent. As I read through them, I discovered correspondence between Vanessa and various event organizers, community groups, and family committees. The language was always careful. She never directly claimed ownership of my accomplishments. Instead, she positioned herself as a mentor, an advisor, or a guiding force. The distinction seemed minor, but the effect was enormous. Over time, listeners filled in the blanks themselves. By the end of the stack, I felt emotionally exhausted. My father had been right. Memories were not disappearing. They were being rewritten. So what happens now? I finally asked. My mother remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked directly into my eyes. That depends on you. I frowned. What do you mean? She gently placed her hand over mine. You can keep carrying this quietly like you always have. Or you can finally let the truth speak for itself. I glanced at the mountain of documents spread across the bed. Contracts, letters, statements, evidence collected across 2 decades. None of it required arguments. None of it required revenge. The facts were already there. My mother stood and walked toward the window. The family is gathering again on Sunday, she said softly. Everyone will be there. I immediately understood what she was suggesting. My heart began to race. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt clarity. And as I looked down at the records my parents had protected for so many years, I realized Sunday might be the day the entire family finally learned what really happened. Sunday arrived faster than I expected. By noon, my daughter's house was once again filled with familiar voices. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Children ran between rooms. Football played quietly in the background. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. To everyone else, it looked like another ordinary family gathering. But for me, everything felt different. The wooden box sat in the trunk of my car, along with 2 folders containing copies of the documents my parents had preserved for decades. I had spent the previous 2 days reading every page, every contract, every letter, every statement. By the time I finished, there was no longer any doubt. The truth was not hidden because it was weak. It had been hidden because people found comfort in a simpler story. Vanessa arrived shortly after lunch. As usual, she quickly became the center of attention. Relatives gathered around her. Conversations drifted toward family history, community projects, and business success. I listened quietly from across the room. Then Daniel stood and tapped his glass with a spoon. The room gradually settled into silence. Before we finish today, he announced, smiling toward Vanessa, I would like to recognize someone whose guidance has shaped this family for years. Several people nodded immediately. I saw Vanessa lower her eyes modestly. Many of us would not be where we are without her leadership and support. Applause began spreading through the room. I noticed my mother sitting quietly near the fireplace. Her expression remained calm. She simply waited. Daniel continued speaking. We often talk about success, but behind every success story, there is usually someone working behind the scenes. For our family, that person has always been Aunt Vanessa. More applause followed. Then Daniel lifted a framed certificate and handed it to her. Vanessa accepted it gracefully. For a brief moment, I considered remaining silent. It would have been easier. It was what I had done for years. But before I could make a decision, my mother slowly rose from her chair. The room immediately became quiet. At 88 years old, Margaret Carter rarely interrupted family events. Everyone noticed. Vanessa looked surprised. Daniel stopped speaking. My mother stepped forward carefully. Before we continue, she said in a steady voice, there is something the family needs to see. The room froze. She looked toward me. I understood immediately. Without saying a word, I walked to the front hallway and retrieved the box from my car. When I returned, curious eyes followed every step. I placed the box on the dining room table. My mother rested one hand gently on its lid. "Your father asked me to protect these records," she said. "He believed that one day the truth might need help finding its way back home." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then she opened the box. And for the first time in more than 20 years, the evidence hidden inside was about to be seen by everyone. The room remained silent as my mother removed the documents one by one. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody laughed. The confidence that had filled the gathering only minutes earlier seemed to disappear. First came the early contracts bearing my signature, then the meeting records, then the letters written by my father. Finally, she placed Ethan Brooks's notarized statement in the center of the table. One by one, family members stepped forward to read. I watched their expressions change. Curiosity became confusion. Confusion became realization. Daniel was the first to speak. He picked up the statement and read it twice before lowering it slowly. "I did not know any of this," he said quietly. My mother nodded. "That is because you were never shown." Vanessa remained seated. Her hands rested motionless in her lap. For the first time in years, she seemed unable to find the right words. Nobody attacked her. Nobody raised their voice. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. My mother then unfolded my father's final letter and read a passage aloud. He wrote that truth often loses ground not because it is weak, but because good people assume it will defend itself. He warned that family stories should never be built on convenience. They should be built on facts. When she finished reading, the room fell silent again. I looked around and saw relatives studying old photographs, contracts, and correspondence. The evidence stretched across decades. It told a story that had never changed because it had always been true. Daniel slowly walked toward me. His eyes were filled with regret. "Aunt Rachel," he said, "I am sorry. I honestly believed what I had been told." I smiled gently. I know. And I did know. Most of the people in that room had never intended to hurt me. They had simply accepted a version of history repeated often enough to sound real. Several others offered apologies. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked disappointed. But none of them looked angry. The truth had a way of removing the need for arguments. Eventually, Vanessa stood. For a moment, I thought she might challenge the documents. Instead, she looked around the room and lowered her eyes. "I never expected this to go this far," she said softly. Nobody responded. There was nothing left to debate. The records answered every question. My mother closed the wooden box and placed her hand on top of it. "Your father protected these papers because he loved this family," she said. "Not because he wanted conflict. He wanted honesty." As the afternoon drew to a close, conversation slowly resumed. Children returned to playing. Coffee was poured again. Life continued. Yet something important had changed. For the first time in many years, the family understood how the company had truly been built. Not through rumors, not through assumptions, through hard work, sacrifice, and persistence. Later that evening, as I drove home beneath the fading winter sky, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. I had not won an argument. I had not defeated anyone. What I regained was something far more valuable. I regained ownership of my own story. And as I thought about my parents, especially my father who had prepared for this moment years before it arrived, I realized success was never the most important thing I built. The most important thing was the truth. And finally, after all these years, it had found its way home.